Ain't stolen cousins. You already know what time it is. Animated horror stories. Animated horror stories. You see where we at today. We are at our good stolen cousins SSG Animations house. What are we watching? True crime murder, true crime family murders. Chilling horror story, chilling horror stories animated. Goodness, if I could speak. Y'all ready? I know I am. So please do me a favor, go over to SSG Animations House. Please subscribe to their channel, watch some videos, and then come back. You should already be subscribed over here, and if you are not, please do so. And be sure to like the video. Let's go on and jump on into this. Please grab a blunt, grab a bottle of water, grab a bag of chips, and grab a blanket so you can be snug. All right. You know it's gonna be crazy. Look at that man. I'm looking wild. Looking crazy.
I'd known James Anderson since he moved in next door, and he was the definition of a family man.
Okay.
I would always see him with his wife and their two little girls, and I often told myself that if I ever got married and had a family, I'd want it to be like theirs. They were the picture-perfect family, and they brought a ray of sunshine to our little town. It had been about 5 years since they moved into the neighborhood, and I had bonded with James over our shared love of fishing. We also worked together as oil field operators at a nearby oil storage facility. Our shared job led us to spend a lot of time together, both during and after work, and it made us grow even closer. It soon felt like I was part of their little family, as they often invited me over for special dinners and trips. Everything was going great for the family at the time. James was doing well at work, and Diane, who was now 13 weeks pregnant, was expecting a bouncing baby boy. But around the month of July that year, numerous things started to go wrong with their perfect family. It was around this time that James invited me to a fishing trip with the family like he usually did, and I was glad to go. This particular fishing trip went perfectly at first. I would wake up early with James, and we'd go to the lake to start fishing. James's wife Diane would often tell us to spend more time in bed, as she worried we weren't getting enough sleep. She would always say, "Isn't it too early to go fishing? The fish aren't going to grow legs and run off to Mexico anytime soon, so try to get a little more sleep." We usually laughed at her remarks before telling her that we couldn't go back to bed, as any true fisherman knows that one of the best times to fish is very early in the morning, within an hour of sunrise. After spending our mornings fishing, we'd come back to have a little barbecue and grill what we caught. We'd usually tell jokes and laugh together during these little barbecues, as James and Diane's little girls played in the grass. But for the first time, things weren't like that, and I could tell something was off. Diane had a worried look on her face, and James was awfully quiet. A little while after this, James left to check on the grilling fish. Diane then took my hand and said,
"Ted, I know you're one of the closest friends my James has, so if you'd let me, there's something I've been meaning to ask you."
I had never seen Diane with such a serious look on her face, so I said,
What,
"Sure,
girl?"
I'll answer anything you need to know." Diane then smiled before saying,
Do you know if there's anything going on with James? He's been pretty distant lately.
I had known Diane for about 5 years now, and in that time, I'd come to realize that she was one of the sweetest women I'd ever met. She also had a great sense of humor, and she was a good mother to her kids. I would have never pegged Diane as one of those jealous or paranoid wives who always thought something was secretly going on. It was totally out of character, as Diane was nothing like those women. At first, I thought it was just the pregnancy hormones talking,
Just because you're
but I
asking
could
if
tell she
everything's
was
going
very
on with
worried,
your husband,
so
you
I
have to
told
be
her,
one of those
"Look,
women."
Diane, there's no need to worry. James is probably just in one of his moods, and it'll pass soon." Diane then looked at me and said,
Are you sure, Ted? Because I really feel like something is off.
I then responded with, "Come on, Diane. It's James we're talking about here. That man loves you to death, so there's absolutely nothing to worry about." My assurances put Diane at ease, and I was glad I was able to clear
Thinking
things
about
up.
cheating. She's thinking
I
about
knew James
second
very
progress.
well, and he wasn't
Like,
that
you know,
kind of
she got
man.
his
At the
brain.
time, I thought Diane was
She's like,
just
"What's
being
wrong with
anxious
you?"
and paranoid for no reason. But in the following weeks, I started to notice that there might have been some truth to Diane's worry, as James began showing some very odd behavior at work.
Nah, he's good.
James would
Please,
mysteriously
son.
disappear for a few hours during work, and he'd come back with no real explanation, as any time I asked, he'd just give me bad excuses. He also started arriving late at home, as I rarely saw his car in his driveway when I came home from work. All this seemed very
Okay, I was
suspicious,
about to say, y'all
and it
was
was
so
very out of
excited
character
about
for
that.
James. I decided to pay him a visit and ask him about everything the very next day. I knew Diane had been out of the house on a weekend trip, and she wouldn't be arriving until the next day. So I thought it'd be the best time to talk, and I hoped nothing shady was going on for Diane's sake. Once I arrived at work the next day, I tried to find James, but he wasn't there. I told myself he was probably running late, so I waited for him to arrive, but he never did. After work that day, I started preparing to go to James's house to talk with him, but our boss told all of us to stay behind and celebrate with him, as it was his birthday. I couldn't say no, so I ended up staying very late with my boss and colleagues, drinking beer and eating some cake. The small party lasted really late, as we were at the oil storage facility until 3 a.m. the next morning. I had completely lost track of time, and I was a little bit wasted because I couldn't hold my liquor. It was hard to walk because I drank a bit too much. So I made my way to my car to sleep for a bit and sober up before making my way home. As I got to my car, I noticed a truck pulling into the oil storage facility, not that far from where I was parked. It was pretty dark, but I was sure that it was James's truck, and I wondered, what was he doing showing up to work around 3 a.m.? I was about to walk up to him when I saw him pull a woman's body out of the back of his truck. The ghastly scene made me freeze as I was shocked to my core. I then watched in horror as James roughly threw the woman on the ground, and even though it was dark, I could tell from the swollen belly that it was his wife, Diane. She fell flat on her stomach, but she didn't scream, and I noticed she wasn't moving. Horrified, I started to move toward them, but for some reason, my legs couldn't carry me. As I said earlier, I had drunk too much beer, and I couldn't even walk right. I then saw James drag out two little girls from his truck. I tried my best to walk again, so I could stop James, but I helplessly fell to the floor as the effects of the liquor were really hitting me. There was a bit of distance from the truck, but I could still hear the little girls' screams as they were forcefully dragged out of the car. James then picked up the first girl and held his hand over her face. My vision was blurry and I couldn't see well, but I could tell that he was choking the child to death. I could see the little girl's legs thrashing about as she begged and struggled for air, but James didn't let up as he kept smothering his own child, and it wasn't long after that before she stopped moving. James then set his eyes on his second daughter, and he proceeded to carry out the same morbid act as he also smothered his second child to death.
And you just watched.
Once again, I told myself that my eyes had to be playing some sort of trick on me because there was no way James had just killed his two little daughters and his pregnant wife in front of me. The world started getting foggy around me now, but I was still able to see James taking his girls' motionless bodies to some nearby oil tanks, and when he returned, he took out a shovel and started digging. I wasn't able to see what he did next as I passed out a few minutes later. I woke up on the floor a few hours later, and I was still frightened at what I had witnessed the night before. I wasn't sure if I could drive, so I walked home. There was only a few hours before work, but I didn't want to go to work that day, so I called in sick. All I could see when I closed my eyes were the horrific scenes from the night before, and they terrified me so much that I didn't leave my house out of fear that I'd run into James. I told myself that I hallucinated it all to keep my sanity, but it wasn't long till it was reported on the news that Diane and her two children were missing. I also saw James on the news urging people to help find his missing family, and I've known him long enough to tell that he was lying and putting on an act. I thought about going to the police to tell them what I saw, but I knew they wouldn't believe me as I was heavily intoxicated, so my testimony would have been thrown out. Plus, it was my word against James, and I didn't have any proof. He was also both the husband and father of the missing parties, so I knew the police will likely side with him. I was furious that James would get away with murdering his family, but unbeknownst to me, justice was close by, as James was arrested the very next day. He had apparently lied during an interrogation, and he failed a polygraph test. The officers, who were now very suspicious of him, backed him into a corner, and he eventually confessed to murdering his wife and his two daughters. The incident took the entire country by storm, as it was revealed that James was having an affair. The cops believed it was this affair that led James to kill his entire family in order to be with his new woman. After a search of the oil storage facility, Diane's body was found buried in a shallow grave, and the two girls were found in crude oil storage tanks.
Sickening.
James pleaded guilty in court, and he was sentenced to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole. It's been a while since this ghastly incident, but I'm still horrified at the fact that I knew this man for all those years and couldn't tell that he was wearing a mask. It really made me wonder how many people around me could one day become cold-blooded family killers. I also beat myself up for witnessing the murder and not being able to do anything about it.
Oh, shut up.
I've sworn off beer since that day, as if I wasn't heavily drunk on that fateful day.
Like,
Diane,
here's the issue.
her unborn child, and her 2 little girls might have been here today. At the end of it all, what these gruesome murders have taught me is that the big bad killer isn't always stalking you down a dark street like we've been led to believe.
It never is that way.
Sometimes the killer is sleeping in the very same bed as you.
Mm-hmm. Close your damn eyes.
The story you just heard was loosely based on the real-life case of Christopher Lee Watts.
Mm-hmm.
On August 13th, 2018, in Frederick, Colorado, American oil field operator Christopher Watts brutally murdered his pregnant wife Shannon by strangulation. He then killed their 2 children, Bella, 4, and Celeste, 3, by smothering them. After the murders, Chris shoved his children's bodies into crude oil tanks before burying his wife Shannon in a shallow grave close to an oil storage facility.
Sick
Christopher
bastard.
originally played innocent as he made people believe he was a grieving father, but all the investigations soon pointed to him as the culprit. After his arrest on the 15th of August, he was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of murdering a child that was 12 years of age or younger, 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body, and the unlawful termination of a pregnancy.
Mm-mm.
Chris had committed not only familicide, but also mass murder, feticide, filicide, exorcide, and child murder. He was sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences plus 84 years without the possibility of parole on the 19th of November, 2018, and he's currently carrying out his sentence at the Dodge Correctional Institution, a maximum security prison in Waupun, Wisconsin.
Oh, as he deserves.
My name is Matthew Montgomery, and for about 5 years, I lived in a rented home in Nashville, Tennessee. My wife and I got married young, so at the time, we decided to rent a house, as we hadn't really found our footing and couldn't afford to own one. The only problem was the house we moved into already had a previous tenant named James Strong, who was now living in the basement, as he could no longer afford the rest of the home. Initially, the thought of living with a random stranger in our basement wasn't something we were keen on. But despite our lack of enthusiasm, we both agreed to the arrangement, as there wasn't a better alternative and we couldn't afford to rent the whole house. In the first weeks of living there, my wife and I made sure to have as little interactions with Jason as possible. But as time passed, the weeks turned into months and months turned into years. Soon enough, we began having regular meals with Jason, and although he was sometimes strange, it wasn't long till Jason became a part of the family. It had been 4 years since moving into the house now, and although Jason had always been an unusual character, he had begun acting extremely odd. I noticed Jason started coming home around 3 a.m. The only reason we even knew a specific time was because, more often than not, we'd regularly be woken up by loud grunting noises coming from downstairs. We decided to ask Jason about the noises and why he'd been coming home so late recently. He simply responded with, "Oh, that. Yeah, my boss decided to put me on the late shifts. They're a real pain in the ass, so I usually go for a drink after. I'll try to be a little quieter next time. Didn't mean to wake you up." At the time, we trusted Jason completely, and there was no reason to be suspicious, so we simply took his word for it and didn't address the situation again. A couple of months had passed since our conversation with Jason. Despite his attempts to be a little quieter when coming home late, I still occasionally woke up to strange noises coming from downstairs. Little did I know, later that week, something would happen that would lead to the most horrific discovery in my life.
Hey, babe, I think there's something wrong with our tub.
I turned around that morning to see my wife standing in our room with a towel. "You sure? What's wrong with it?" I replied,
He had to
and
go
she
in the
responded
basement.
with,
I don't know. Just go take a look. I don't think it's draining.
I walked to the bathroom to see the bathtub filled with water and releasing waste from its drain. Our toilets and sinks were also clogged, so we decided to ask Jason if he had been experiencing the same thing in the basement, as I didn't know much about stuff like that. Hey man, good morning. Jason was sitting in the living room downstairs, and looking at him, I could tell he hadn't taken a shower that morning. Jason, we're having a problem with our sinks and toilets. I think they're clogged, so we can't really shower or do much up there. Is yours good, or do we need to call a plumber? A worried expression fell on Jason as he replied, No, there's no need to call a plumber. The pipes in this building always do this. I'll come fix it for you right now. Jason got up and immediately stormed upstairs to our bathroom.
Boy.
He messed around with them a bit, and eventually, they all cleared up. We thanked him, and he simply smiled at us before hurrying back downstairs. But that morning wasn't the end of the clogged drains, as the very next day, every single thing he fixed was back the exact same way.
Ain't did not a damn.
This went on for almost 3 weeks, and each time we offered to call the plumbers, Jason would immediately refuse, explaining this isn't a new situation and he could fix it. That never
Definitely
seemed
a
to be
new
the case though,
situation.
and after a while, my wife and I decided it was time to finally call a professional. It didn't take long for the plumbers to arrive. Jason opened the door for them, and I could tell from his facial expression that he wasn't too pleased we had called them. He let them in, and my wife immediately took them upstairs to show them the issue. That's when Jason stormed towards me and grabbed me, saying, "Why would you call them? I told you I would handle it."
Don't grab
I was
me.
shocked as I'd never seen Jason act that way. "Jason, relax. We'll pay for everything. There's no need to get worked up for nothing." He walked closer and was about to respond, but was interrupted by a voice saying, "Okay, sir. We've looked around and the problem seems to be coming from the main drainage. It should be in the basement." Jason didn't seem happy about the news, but he simply let me go and hinted for the plumbers to follow as he led the way to the basement. After 4 years of living together, my wife and I had rarely ever gone into Jason's room, as we all respected each other's privacy. But as we walked
Yeah,
into
that's
his room
right.
that day, our shock from the mere state of his room was written all over our faces. There were blunts, drugs, and food all over the place. The room was also drenched in water and reeked of sewage. The plumbers immediately began doing their jobs, and my wife and I decided to go upstairs and let them work. Jason, on the other hand, refused to leave the room, claiming he didn't trust them, closely following everything the plumbers did.
Because what you got down there, Jason?
We waited upstairs for about an hour, and eventually, the plumbers both came out of the basement. "Okay, that's it for today. It should all be fine now." The plumber that spoke to me was holding a tiny white plastic in his hand. They both looked terrified at the moment, and before I could even ask how much I owed, they hurriedly left the house without another word. Jason still hadn't come out from the basement, and all we could hear was the sound of him frantically throwing things around before eventually letting out a large scream. It was our first time seeing Jason act this way, as we always knew him
What did
as a
they
calm
see
and
in the
collected person.
basement? Hurry
We decided
up,
against
speak.
going into the basement to check on him, and instead went up to our room to take a shower, as we hadn't been able to take a proper one earlier that day. About 3 hours had passed, and the house was still completely silent. My wife and I
was
began to
gone.
worry about Jason, so she said,
Honey, I'm worried about Jason. I think we should go check on him, see if he's all right.
I agreed, and despite his behavior, I was still genuinely concerned about him. "Yeah, I'll be right behind you." As my wife opened our bedroom door, she was met by the oddly terrifying
Hell
sight
no.
of Jason
Jump
looming
him.
over her. Jason had a large frame and stood about
Like
6
right
foot
now.
5.
Not now, but now.
His head was tilted down towards the floor, and his lips were mumbling something neither of us could hear. My wife let out a light scream and laughed as she said,
Jason, stop playing around. You almost gave me a heart attack.
My wife didn't seem to notice the complete change in Jason's aura at that moment. But I, on the other hand, immediately knew something was wrong. I got up slowly to approach them, but before I could even get there, Jason suddenly grabbed her neck and flung her over the stairs.
Oh!
My heart instantly dropped to the floor as all I heard was her scream followed by a loud thud. Immediately, I pushed past Jason and ran downstairs to see if she was okay. Her eyes were open, but she wasn't moving, and I comforted her as she gasped for air. Tears began to fill my eyes as I heard Jason begin to walk down the stairs. Every step he took made the stairs creak, and after a while,
boy,
his
if you
large
don't
figure was
get up.
standing over me again. I didn't want to do this, you know. His calm demeanor had now returned as he stood over both of us. He spoke slowly as if trying to teach us something new. You two are like family to me. I love you guys. I really do. But I don't think this is going to be possible anymore. Living with other people might be more of a problem than I thought. He began to pace the living room as his calmness suddenly changed into something else as he proceeded to talking to himself.
He just threw her over the banister.
No, I can't kill them. He turned suddenly as if responding to himself and said, But you must know they're a problem now, Jason. I simply watched in horror as I saw Jason for what he truly was now. An insane person. He stopped suddenly and stared at me as he calmly uttered the words, I'm sorry, Matt. He began to walk towards me again, and before I could plead with him for my life, we were interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. Jason didn't seem to care about the crime scene he had just created in the living room as he turned to me, placed a finger over his lips, and said, She fell. Before simply walking over to the door and opening it.
Boy, you lying. This ain't no damn domestic relationship.
My heart was instantly filled with relief as I saw the 3 police officers standing outside my door.
He just
Jason,
threw my
on
baby
the other
over the
hand,
banister.
didn't seem fazed as he simply let out a sigh before saying, Okay, the jig's up. It's a body. If you want the rest of her, she's in the freezer. It was only at this moment the cops noticed what was happening in the house.
What freezer? Kitchen?
They immediately detained Jason and called for paramedics to attend to us.
You better have a
But
damn
as they
deep
took Jason
freezer,
away,
Jason.
he turned to me and said, Goodbye, Matthew. I hope Anna's okay. In the coming weeks, the shocking discoveries that were made about Jason Strong were as followed. The plumbers we had hired to clean our drains had placed a call to the authorities immediately after leaving our home, stating they had discovered a large chunk of what seemed to be flesh stuffed in the drains. Jason did not bother denying any of the horrific crimes he committed, and the body found in the freezer was identified to be the body of an 18-year-old girl named Robin Richards, who had been missing for almost 6 months now. The police also found in Jason's room a knife that contained DNA from another girl who had been missing for 10 years at the time.
Oh my God.
In Jason's interrogation,
Y'all
the police
was
were
there
surprised
before.
by the complete lack of remorse, as Jason almost seemed eager to inform them about his numerous killings and didn't seem to care at all about the feelings of their families. Upon watching his interrogation tape, the court decided Jason was a truly evil psychopath, and there was no sense in
Good.
giving him anything other than the death penalty.
Exactly.
As such, Jason was executed later that year on November 5th, 2021, with his last and only words being, Tell my family I love them. This story is
Being
loosely
Mike
based
and
on
Anna?
events from the horrific case of Adam Strong in Oshawa, Canada, 2017.
In Canada?
Strong was arrested and tried for the murder and manslaughter of 2 females, both of whom he killed and dismembered approximately 6 years apart.
Oh.
The remains of both females were found after the authorities were informed by plumbers of what seemed to be flesh-like remains in Strong's home. After investigations,
crazy. He
Strong
called
was
the
sentenced
plumber.
to life imprisonment with no chance of parole for 25 years.
Good.
Upon hearing his sentence, the courtroom applauded, as there was a common feeling that this was what the psychopath deserved. Strong still serves his time to this day and will continue to pay for the crimes he committed against his innocent victims.
I love true crime stories because you will never know somebody fully living with them. Like, it takes time. They was living with that man for 4 years. Or was it, or did they say like 2 years plus 4 years later? You know, they was living with that man for a minute. And he was just killing people on the side. Like, obviously, I apologize. Like, obviously, it's loosely based, but like, even in reality, the people around that man didn't realize that something was going on with him. He kidnapped and murdered two girls 6 years apart. Like, you know what I mean? The first one always and will always piss me off because that man really killed his pregnant wife and two living children for an affair. I believe in his story, like he was a little chunky, started working out, started feeling himself a little too much, fell in love with Shorty at the gym, and then decided to start cheating. Like, you want to cheat, you can cheat in peace. Don't sit there and start lying to that girl saying you ain't cheating, and then, you know, cheating on your pregnant wife is one thing, but to murder your whole family, you need to be underneath the jail. He needed a death sentence. Let me know your feelings and emotions in the comments. Have you already heard these two stories before? Is this the first time that you're hearing of both of them, or have you heard them before? I know I've heard the first story before. It's my first time hearing the second story because, like I said, Canada. Let me know in the comments. Please remember to like the video. And until next time, you guys, I love you. Bye.